So Sabrina, I know that there are some therapeutic models that do teach touch. So do those cover the kind of material that you're covering, since it's kind of built in?
I don't know every model that's out there, but generally speaking, they do not. Right. So, for example, in the trainings that I do, we talk about the history of touch. Right. And in some ways, the models that use touch as an intervention have the opposite bias as models that say touch is not okay. Right. So the presumption in these models is that touch is beneficial, and that it's beneficial for clients. And it may not be. It may not be for that particular client, right? And so because of the presumption, they are not really exploring the whole ethical considerations. There's usually very little consideration around power differentials, right? Between race and culture and age and gender and sort of all those pieces, right? But also the power differential between being a therapist and having a client. And as much as we try to minimize that, it's still there. Right. And so oftentimes the touch between client and therapist often goes in the direction of therapists touching clients. And that's not cool. Okay. Clients need to know that they can reach out if we're offering touch. Okay. There's also, this one point that I think is really, really critical. Before we ever put our hands on our clients, we need to know that we have consent, right? However, you can't say yes if you don't know how to say no. I don't know any training programs that are teaching clients and making sure that they know how to say no. Right? So I need to assure that my clients actually can say no, and then they know that I'm going to receive that with no reaction, but just with the same amount of love I would give them in any other situation, and that they can say no in any way they need. They could say, "Get your fucking hands off me." They could scream at me. They could yell at me. They could say no, and I would still be able to hold that space. Right? And so consent is a really important component. It's also a really important component when we're working with people in non-ordinary states of consciousness. There's the ethical question is, if you are in a regress state, can you really consent? If you are a child, can you consent? If you are, there's a lot of work right now in psychedelic integration and psychedelic guiding, and I do psychedelic integration. And if you're sitting with a client when they're using MDMA, right? This right now is only available in clinical trials, or ketamine, which is legal. They are in an altered state of consciousness. Can they consent in that moment? Right? And so that really needs to be explored, is how do you navigate consent in these states when touch can be super helpful? Right? And a lot of the work has to be done on the back end, right? Before.
You mean the work has to be done on the part of the therapist before the session ever happens?
Yes, that's part of it. But also we need to really be clear on client consent before they move into an altered state of consciousness. And there are therapeutic models, for example, hypnosis. Internal family systems does take us into an altered state of consciousness. And so we really need to be clear that there is consent before we ever go into that process. We also need to know that we know how to process a rupture. And I don't think a lot of models are teaching that. We presume in sort of models that use touch, there is a presumption that if I use touch and I'm attuned, that I'm never going to make a rupture. And that's not true. We don't always know what the client's internal experience is. I could feel attuned with a client and touch their shoulder, and maybe the touch of the shoulder is where dad grabbed them before they got raped. right? And so we have to know how to repair such a rupture. And I think that's oftentimes what therapists are terrified of. If I touch my client, that I'm going to, the client's going to perceive it incorrectly. That could happen. But those ruptures happen in the therapeutic process all the time, and we use them as material, right? If I say to a client something like, and how do you feel about that? And maybe they had a therapist previously who constantly said, well, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? And they get triggered by that comment. Doesn't necessarily mean I've done anything wrong. It means that, oh, now we have a trailhead for another wounding that needs to be healed.
So what do you mean when you say we don't know what we don't know?
Right. So, knowledge is an interesting thing. There are categories of knowledge, right? There are what we know. There is what we know that we don't know. So I know that I don't know how to do any kind of plumbing, right? And then there is a category, which is we don't know what we don't know, which most therapists are living into when it comes to touch and therapy, because we haven't been trained, right? We haven't really explored power differentials. We don't know how important communicating is. We don't know, even for those who are using touch, how important it is to ascertain that our clients know how to say no, right? We don't know the indications and contraindications for touch. We don't know how to clinically document the touch, because clinically documenting a touch requires that we know what are all the purposes of touch. Why are we using touch with our clients? So it is a much broader field than people are aware of, right? Whether or not you ever put your hands on your clients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I would like, or other people would probably like to hear more about what do you do if you sign up for a training? Like, what kind of activities are you involved in?
Right.
And what could one expect? So
The first, that I just started doing introductory courses that are online, because a lot of people are online right now. And the introductory courses are 4 hours. They are both experiential and didactic, right? So I do 2 introduction courses. They're both very similar. One of them is specific to integrative psychedelic professionals. And that one plays a little bit more focus on working with people in non-ordinary states of consciousness, right? Because if you're working with, for example, if you are doing MDMA assisted, or you're doing ketamine assisted or psilocybin assisted work, then you really need a little bit more information about that. Okay. But in these trainings, we do a lot of internal exploration. There's some it's the sort of basic, the real point of it is to get clinicians to at least shift from I don't know what I don't know to I know what I don't know. Right. So we do a lot of internal explorations about our own touch history. Right. Some basic information about indications and contraindications. It's a unique training in that a lot of online trainings are highly didactic, and this is not that training, right? There is education, but a lot of it is exploration, because a lot of the work with touch is really around ethics. And so it's the initial preparation. And then I have a larger training. Right now, I'm moving into a certification training program. And there are 3 levels. The first level is the knowledge base, right? So it's the history of touch, the indications, the contraindications, the purposes of touch. So all the details. And then the second level certification is the practical applications, the felt sense, the how do you use touch using an intermediary object so that your hands are actually never on your client, right? Or what are the ways that you can touch a client that are actually not handsy? You could be sitting next to a client and have the side of your arm touching their arm. And that might be what they can tolerate. They might not be able to tolerate looking across from each other, but that feeling of I'm alongside you, and can be super helpful when we're working with, from the internal family systems perspective, right? If we're working with a part that really doesn't trust us, right, and really is sort of combative, we can actually move and sit next to the client. And then there's a sense of like, oh, you're with me rather than at me, right? So we do experientials on receiving touch, right? How does my intention of touch affect how the client receives touch? How does the type of touch affect how it's received? And why would you use different types of touch, right? For example, if you use hard, so I don't know if you can see my little muscles working, right? I'm using a kind of stroking, not a stroking, a compression technique that's rhythmic, right? Calms the nervous system. It's like the big bear hug or the weighted blanket, right? And so the second level certification is that for 2022, those two trainings are combined. So it's a good time to get in.
Mm-hmm.
And
so are those, so both of those trainings are virtual right now?
The introduction is virtual. The certification is live right now. In 2023, they're going to be separated. The didactic will be all online and the experiential will be live. So I'm so passionate about teaching. I'm so passionate about wanting clinicians to be better trained, right? Because we're missing a really important component of connectivity, which is really where the healing happens. So,
yeah, I love that you talked through the, this idea underlying all your work about this connection, because that's so tied to why touch is important.
right. And it's often the reason why, I often at this point work more as a spiritual midwife and transpersonal coach, because for me, psychotherapy is in some ways limited. I kept trying to call myself like a transpersonal psychotherapist or holistic psychotherapist, or like all these sort of qualifiers for therapists, trying to explain these other elements that I incorporate into my work. And at some point, it just started to feel inauthentic. That the work that I do, yes, trauma work is a component of it, right? IFS is a component of it, but so is ritual. And so is reconnecting to the earth. And so is community building. And so is connecting to the divine and finding the ways that we do that. And it might be being out in nature, and it might be chanting, and it might be making art. And so my orientation is that we cannot have a psychotherapy that doesn't include spirituality and think that we are going to heal people. Right? That we are psycho-spiritual beings. And so my belief is that we have to provide a more holistic orientation to healing. And psychotherapy just doesn't do that. I mean, there are models that incorporate it, but I think I've moved away from me sort of naming that for myself, in part also as a woman, as a feminist, as a gender fluid person, that as a culturally mixed person. Psychotherapy is rooted in patriarchy. It's rooted in Western concepts of individualism. When I did my undergraduate work, I chose to do my undergraduate work in sociology, not psychology. And I chose to do that because even in my 20s, having the cultural background that I do, it was really obvious to me that that psychotherapy puts the onus on the individual, right? As if we are somehow broken or we are somehow wrong, right? Super pathological, super medical, right? Rather than the understanding that, if I have body issues as a woman in American culture, it is not my issue. It is our issue. It is a cultural issue, right? If we have, embedded racism, It's not just my issue. It's a cultural issue. We share this. We have to work on it together. And having that orientation can sort of alleviate what we would call in Buddhism the second arrow. So in Buddhism, the first arrow is, our original suffering. And then the second arrow is how we sort of self-flagellate ourselves for having the first arrow, the first thing in the first place, right? And so beginning to understand, like I can't tell you how many therapists I work with that have, for example, body issues, right? And they're feminists and I know better, and they could go on this like whipping. I was like, sweetie, you are living in a culture that day in and day out sends the message that our value and our worth as women is based on our physicality. And so we are constantly, trying to fight against this barrage that happens at that subtle and non-subtle levels. So we need to really take a different, and in my orientations, we need a really different orientation to the field.
That seems, that feels so revolutionary. We'll have to talk about that more.